Stop listening to Spanish you can't understand. If you're doing okay at speaking Spanish, but you can't understand the vast majority of the Spanish that you hear, here are 3 tactics you need to focus your efforts on to get to the next level. And the first one is finding Spanish listening materials that are actually within your abilities to understand. The second tactic is using those listening materials in an active 3-step process that I'll describe later in this video. It's proven to help you understand Spanish better within minutes. And then the third tactic to focus on is accumulating more vocabulary, but specifically the right vocabulary based on the things you learn in the first 2 tactics. Let's start with tactic 1. Find Spanish materials that you can understand. This is probably the most controversial tactic here, but here's why it's so powerful and why I'm so insistent that you shouldn't listen to Spanish that you can't understand. Listening comprehension is a big deal, and it's not something you just get better at automatically. And that's partly because your brain is actually really sophisticated at choosing how to listen based on its own priorities. So like right now, as you're listening to my voice, this probably isn't the only sound reaching your ears. You're also hearing maybe the humming of your air conditioner, the noise of traffic, the squeaking of your chair, maybe some voices nearby. But you're not consciously processing all of that because your brain is subconsciously deciding what to pay attention to based on what it thinks is meaningful. Everything else, whatever it thinks is not meaningful, gets filtered out. So here's the punchline. When you hear Spanish, does your brain tune in and listen for meaning, or does it more often register it as meaningless noise? We want to train our brains to tune in, not tune out. When you hear Spanish that makes sense, words and phrases that register as meaningful, it gives your brain the message that it should keep listening and pay attention whenever you hear Spanish. You don't want it to interpret Spanish as meaningless. So that's why you should listen to lots of Spanish that actually does register in your brain. Instead of a vicious cycle of getting frustrated and tuning Spanish out, it actually creates a virtuous cycle of understanding Spanish and tuning in each time you hear Spanish spoken. Okay, so how do we find Spanish that you can understand? Well, there are 2 key factors to consider. Number 1, can you get a written transcript of the audio? And number 2, is it the right difficulty level for you? You want a written transcript because you want to make sure you're actually learning from what you're hearing. This way you can go back and forth between the audio and the text to gauge your progress. Some Spanish TV and movies do have accurate subtitles, although not all of them do. And then songs are also great because you can find accurate lyrics for most mainstream Latin music. Another option that I love is books. So if you're advanced enough for this, I recommend choosing one of your favorite books and getting a Spanish translation of both the text and the audiobook. That way you can read and listen at the same time, and you can choose a subject that's interesting to you or a story you already know and love. But of course, you want to find something that's at the right level of difficulty based on your current abilities. You want something that you can understand, but of course, you don't want to just listen to things that are super easy. The goal is to reach a new level of understanding in each practice session. So you want something right at that sweet spot where it's a little challenging, but not frustrating or impossible. So here's a good trick for measuring this. Let's say you've found something, maybe a song or a book or whatever, and you're looking at the transcript. Start by counting the words and idioms that you don't currently understand. If there are more than about 2 per sentence, you should find something simpler. Then, if it passes that test, your next task is to listen to it while following along with the text. If you lose your place more than once per sentence, it's too advanced for your current listening abilities. On the other hand, if you're understanding everything without the slightest difficulty, you should look for something a little more challenging. All right, now let's say you have those materials that are right at your level, just at the edge of your current comfort zone. Let's dive into tactic 2, which is our 3-step process for using those materials to help you understand Spanish better within minutes. So you should do this every time you sit down to work on Spanish listening. I recommend starting with a small passage of whatever you're studying, maybe one verse of a song or one paragraph of a book. Once you've followed all 3 steps I'm about to describe, you'll have full understanding of that portion of the material, and then you can move on to the next section. Step 1 is to go through the written transcript and search for any terms or phrases that you aren't familiar with. There's really no point in trying to understand something when it uses words that just aren't in your vocabulary. Find those words and phrases that are outside your vocabulary, look up their meanings, and make sure you can understand them within the context of what you're reading. As a bonus, you can turn these new words and phrases into flashcards that you can review on a regular basis. That way you won't just learn them for the sake of this one listening session, you'll make them a permanent part of your Spanish vocabulary. For more ideas on how to make this work for you, you can check out our videos on Spanish flashcards. Alright, step 2. Once you've learned all the vocabulary that you don't know, the next step is to read through the passage while listening to the audio until you achieve perfect comprehension. This might be harder than it sounds. Even if you're already familiar with it and should theoretically be able to understand it all, listening to a recording of a native speaker tends to be a lot harder than just reading the text at your own pace. So while you're doing step 2, make sure to pause the audio whenever you're having trouble, and during this step, be very self-aware and honest with yourself. When you have the slightest difficulty keeping up with the meaning of what you're reading, make sure to stop the audio, study the text, back up by a few seconds, and listen again. If you do that, and now you can understand what you're hearing, then you can keep going. Once you get through that entire passage, maybe that verse of the song or that paragraph of the book, then start over and go through it again. Theoretically, at this point, you should be able to follow everything perfectly, but not necessarily. If you still struggle to keep up with the meaning at certain points, it's a good idea to practice saying the difficult phrases out loud. When you speak a phrase yourself with your own voice, it can help solidify it in your brain. And that way, you'll know to expect to hear that specific phrase the next time you go through the passage. So keep doing this, keep reading and listening along, and then step 2 is done once you're able to listen through the entire passage and perfectly understand it all in real time. Step 3, the final step, is to listen to the passage without looking at the transcript. So you're only using your ears this time. And this is going to require a lot of intense focus. Just like in step 2, be really self-aware and critically honest with how well you're understanding what you're hearing. Make sure to pause the audio whenever you struggle or whenever you zone out. If you get completely stuck, refer back to the transcript, review what's being said at that moment, practice saying it out loud, and then rewind by a few seconds and try again. Once you get through the whole passage, start it over and see if you can listen through the whole thing, understanding everything you're hearing without pausing. When you reach that point, you're ready for a break. You've earned it. Then it's time to move on to the next passage and start the process again from step 1. All right, let's move on to tactic 3. So if you're using tactics 1 and 2 to find really good Spanish listening materials at your level and to get really productive listening practice with them, 2 things are going to happen. You are going to get better and better at understanding the Spanish that's within your vocabulary, but you're also going to realize that there is one very specific limit, and that's how little Spanish you know. No matter how good you are at interpreting the Spanish you hear and turning it into meaning in your brain, there's a problem. If the Spanish that you're listening to includes any words that are outside your vocabulary, you're gonna get lost. Even if you know 1,000 words in Spanish, all it takes is one word to completely throw you off. So that's why our third tactic for understanding more Spanish is simply to go out there and learn more vocabulary. And this can be overwhelming because there are about 100,000 words in the Spanish dictionary. But the good news is that we can actually use data to make this a lot simpler. Some words are used a lot more than others, and by focusing on the most used words first, you can make sure that you're getting the best return on how much time you invest in learning new vocabulary. By learning the most frequently used words first, you're getting a 100 times, or in some cases, 1,000 times return on what you'd get by learning most Spanish words that you'll find in a textbook. And you can easily find these frequency lists online to go and learn them. But the best news is that we've done all this work for you. We have a free course of 250 lessons that teach the top 1,000 words in Spanish, which account for 90% of all the Spanish you'll ever hear. The course includes lots and lots of listening practice so that you can practice hearing all of the top 1,000 words in an extremely wide variety of contexts, all spoken by native Spanish speakers. As you work through the free course, you'll be able to calibrate your listening skills up or down based on exactly where you are. And yes, there's a transcript for all the audio in the course. So you'll be able to follow tactics 1, 2, and 3 from this video all in one place. Just go to SpanishVideoCourse.com to work on these top 1,000 words and get those Spanish listening skills to the next level for free. And subscribe to this channel for more of our tried and true study techniques for achieving genuine Spanish fluency.